At the funeral of the unfortunate woman, as everyone was crying their hearts out, a lightning bolt suddenly struck the coffin. What happened next left everyone in shock. Jennifer sat at the edge of her bed, the thin, worn-out quilt bunched in her fists. She didn't cry. There was no point anymore. The words from earlier that day still buzzed in her ears like an annoying mosquito she couldn't swat away. "She dresses like a church mouse," one of the girls had sneered behind her, though loud enough for Jennifer to hear. "Bet she doesn't even own a comb." The group of girls had laughed, their perfectly curled ponytails bouncing in sync, the picture of everything Jennifer wasn't. Her grandmother's voice echoed faintly in her mind, a soft reminder she clung to on nights like these. "Everything happens for a reason. You have to be strong and keep moving forward." Jennifer repeated the words to herself in English, though they never quite carried the same weight as when Grandma Renee said them in her firm but gentle Vietnamese accent. Everything happens for a reason. You just have to keep moving forward. But right now, forward felt impossible. Jennifer's transfer to the village school had been an uphill battle from the start. She knew she looked different. Her hand-me-down clothes never quite fit, and her dark, straight hair often hung limply because hairbrushes weren't high on her grandmother's list of priorities. Not that Jennifer blamed her. Grandma Renee had sacrificed enough. Opening her tiny, cramped home to a girl abandoned by both her parents wasn't something most people would do. Still, Jennifer couldn't help but wish her life were a little less lonely. The next morning, the routine was painfully familiar. Grandma Renee was already in the kitchen, stirring a pot of rice porridge. "Eat up, Chow. Big day ahead." Jennifer didn't reply, just nodded as she slid into the wobbly wooden chair at the table. "Thanks, Grandma," she mumbled, spooning a bit of the warm porridge into her mouth. It tasted like comfort, even if the rice grains were stretched thin to last the week. Grandma Renee watched her closely, her eyes narrowing in that way they did when she could tell Jennifer was holding something back. "You let those girls at school bother you again?" Jennifer looked down at her bowl. "No," she lied softly, the spoon clinking against the ceramic edge. Her grandmother didn't push, but Jennifer could feel the weight of her gaze. "Remember what I always tell you, Chow. You're worth more than what they see." Jennifer nodded, but the words felt like a faraway echo, barely breaking through the wall of doubt and insecurity that had built up over the years. At school, Jennifer walked with her head down, clutching her books close to her chest. She'd learned it was easier this way, to avoid eye contact, to shrink herself so small that she might become invisible. But no matter how much she tried to disappear, they always found her. "Hey! Genius!" a voice called out behind her, mocking and shrill. Jennifer didn't turn around, but her pace quickened. A sharp tug at her bag stopped her in her tracks. She spun to face Emma, the ringleader of the group. Emma smiled sweetly, but her eyes gleamed with malice. "I need the answers for math. You'll give them to me, won't you, Jennifer?" Jennifer's heart pounded. I can't," she stammered, clutching her bag tighter. Emma tilted her head, her blonde curls catching the sunlight. "Can't or won't?" Before Jennifer could answer, another girl chimed in. "Why are you being such a snob? You think you're better than us just 'cause you're good at math." The laughter rang in Jennifer's ears, sharp and cruel. She wanted to disappear, but instead she shoved past the mumbling, "Leave me alone." She didn't stop until she reached the small bench under the sycamore tree at the edge of the playground, far from the prying eyes of the other students. That night, Jennifer sat at the kitchen table, her school books spread out before her. The numbers and equations blurred together as she stared at the page, unable to focus. Grandma Renee placed a steaming cup of tea beside her, sitting down quietly. "You're strong, Jennifer. Stronger than you know." "I don't feel strong," Jennifer whispered, her voice cracking. Her grandmother reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Jennifer's. "Strength isn't about how you feel. It's about what you do. You keep studying, keep pushing forward. One day, all this will make sense." Jennifer nodded, though the doubt still clung to her like a shadow. But as the hours ticked by and the house grew quiet, she kept working. In the stillness of the night, Jennifer made a promise to herself. She would keep moving forward no matter how many times the world tried to push her back. Jennifer's days would continue to blur together in a cycle of quiet endurance. School would remain a battlefield, and the girls' taunts would sting just as much as they did now. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny flicker of determination began to take root, a flicker that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard life tried. Jennifer didn't leave her small town with grand dreams, only a simple hope for something better. The city was louder, faster, and far less forgiving than the quiet streets of her grandmother's village. But she told herself this was the start of a new life, one where she could finally be more than the girl people pitied or ignored. She worked hard during the day, sorting through stacks of paperwork in an office so small it barely held her desk and chair. The pay was meager, but it kept her in a cramped studio apartment with peeling wallpaper and a bed that squeaked if she so much as shifted. At night, she roamed the bustling streets, wide-eyed and unsure of how to belong to a place so alive. That was where she met Mark. It started with a simple exchange. Jennifer had been standing outside a diner, fumbling with a broken umbrella in the pouring rain. She was debating whether to make a mad dash for the bus stop or wait it out, when a leather-jacketed figure stepped beside her. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost teasing. Jennifer glanced at him, her guard going up immediately. His dark hair was slick with rain, and the cocky grin on his face reminded her of boys who'd never given her a second look back in high school. "No, thank you," she replied, her tone clipped. But Mark didn't take the hint. "Suit yourself. Though I've got to say, standing here soaking wet doesn't seem like the best plan." She tried to ignore him, but he held out an umbrella, its fabric pristine and dry despite the downpour. Reluctantly, she took it, muttering a soft, "Thanks." That was all it took for Mark to wedge himself into her life. At first, Jennifer couldn't understand why someone like him would even notice her. Mark was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. Confident, charming, and undeniably magnetic. He had a laugh that filled entire rooms and an ease about him that made people want to stay close. Jennifer, with her quiet demeanor and practical clothes, felt like an afterthought in comparison. But Mark didn't treat her that way. He made her feel seen, really seen, for the first time. "You're too hard on yourself," he said one evening as they sat in a dimly lit booth at one of the city's trendier bars. He'd ordered her a drink she couldn't pronounce and grinned when she wrinkled her nose at its strong taste. "I'm just realistic," she replied, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass. Mark leaned closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "No, you're scared. You think if you don't expect much, you won't get hurt. But life doesn't work that way, Jennifer. You've got to take chances." She swallowed hard, unsure how to respond, but the way he said her name, soft yet commanding, made her want to believe him. For a while, being with Mark felt like stepping into another world. He took her to places she'd never dared to go, clubs filled with pulsing music, restaurants where the waiters wore bow ties, and crowded rooftop parties with glittering city views. Jennifer began to change under his influence. She let her hair down more often, started wearing brighter colors, and even laughed a little louder. For the first time, she felt like someone worth noticing. But deep down, a small voice warned her not to get too comfortable. Mark was thrilling, yes, but he was also unpredictable. He would disappear for days without explanation, then return with a charming smile that erased her questions. The cracks began to show after just a few months. Mark started cancelling plans at the last minute, offering flimsy excuses that didn't quite add up. When they were together, he seemed distracted, his phone buzzing constantly with messages he never let her see. Jennifer told herself she was imagining things, that she was being paranoid. But one evening, the truth hit her like a slap. She had decided to surprise Mark at his favorite bar, hoping a spontaneous gesture might rekindle the spark she feared was fading. Instead, she found him in the corner, his arms wrapped around another woman. Jennifer froze, the world tilting as if she'd stepped onto a moving train. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling as she forced herself to approach. He turned, his expression a mix of irritation and boredom. "Jennifer, what are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" she echoed, her voice rising. "What are you doing with her?" The woman slipped away, sensing the tension, but Mark stayed rooted, his face hardening. "Don't make a scene," he said flatly. Jennifer's hands clenched at her sides. "A scene? You've been ignoring me for weeks. And now this? How could you—" Mark cut her off, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should take a look in the mirror, Jennifer. You're boring. You dress like you're going to a church potluck, and you're always clinging like I'm the only thing in your life." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, without warning, her hand flew up, slapping him across the face. The sharp sound echoed in the bar, drawing a few curious glances. Mark glared at her, his jaw tightening, but Jennifer didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and walked out, tears streaming down her face as she pushed through the crowded streets. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. "Is he right?" she whispered to no one. "Am I really that pathetic?" But even as the tears fell, a tiny voice in her mind pushed back against the doubt. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was the beginning of something else. Jennifer hadn't stepped out of her apartment in days. The world outside felt too loud, too full of reminders of her mistakes. The cracked bathroom mirror, the empty refrigerator, even the quiet hum of the radiator, all of it seemed easier to bear than facing people who might see through the thin veil of composure she was trying to hold together. But on the 5th day, the silence grew suffocating. She threw on the first coat she could find, grabbed her purse, and left without a destination in mind. The brisk air stung her cheeks as she wandered aimlessly until she found herself standing outside a small cafe she'd passed 100 times before, but had never entered. Inside, the warm smell of coffee and faint murmur of voices wrapped around her like a blanket. She slid into a corner booth, her hands still shaking slightly from the cold and the weight of her thoughts. When the waitress came by, she ordered tea, though she doubted she'd drink it. The moment the cup was placed in front of her, her chest tightened and tears welled up without warning. She lowered her head, hoping the shadows would hide her face as she sobbed silently into her hands. "Excuse me," a voice said softly. Jennifer froze but didn't look up. She felt someone slide into the seat across from her, uninvited but not intrusive. "You seemed like you could use this," the voice continued. A hand holding a neatly folded handkerchief appeared in her line of sight. Jennifer hesitated, then reached for it without meeting the man's gaze. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said. "But sometimes it helps." Minutes passed before Jennifer dared to glance at him. He was in his mid-30s, maybe older, with dark, thoughtful eyes and a kind expression that lacked the pity she'd grown so accustomed to seeing. His clothes were simple, a little wrinkled, and his jacket looked like it had weathered one too many winters. He didn't ask her name or press her to speak, and that quiet patience made the knot in her chest loosen just a little. "It's been a rough week," she said finally, her voice breaking halfway through the sentence. The man nodded, his gaze steady but unassuming. "I've had a few of those myself. Funny how they seem to drag on forever." Jennifer let out a shaky laugh, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Forever feels about right. Something about the way he listened encouraged her to keep talking. Slowly, haltingly, the story spilled out. Her childhood in a small town, the endless cycle of being overlooked or mocked, and the hope she'd poured into a man who turned out to be as hollow as the promises he made. She told him about Mark, about the humiliation and self-doubt that still clung to her like a second skin. As she spoke, the words came easier, like releasing them into the air might lessen their weight. When she finished, then the man, Coffin, as he eventually introduced himself, didn't offer platitudes or say something trite like, "You'll get over it." Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, and said, "You're stronger than you think." Jennifer blinked, her breath catching. "You don't even know me." "I don't have to," he replied simply. "The fact that you're still here, even after everything, says plenty." In the days that followed, Jennifer found herself returning to the cafe more often than not. Coffin seemed to appear there as if by coincidence, though she suspected he might have been waiting for her. He never pushed her to talk more than she wanted to, and their conversations drifted to lighter topics, books, music, even the weather. But every so often, he'd say something that stuck with her long after she left. "You can't expect other people to see your worth if you don't see it yourself," he told her one afternoon when she shyly admitted she didn't think much of herself. Another time, when she worried aloud about being too broken to move forward, he said, "No one's unbreakable. The trick is learning how to put yourself back together." Jennifer didn't realize how much these moments were changing her, until one evening, standing in front of her mirror again, she noticed something had shifted. Her reflection no longer seemed like a stranger. The woman staring back at her looked tired, yes, but there was a new determination in her eyes, a spark she hadn't seen in years. Jennifer touched her reflection lightly, her fingers grazing the cool surface of the mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't immediately look away. The spark she saw wasn't just determination, it was hope, and it had been so long since she'd felt that in herself that it almost scared her. The next morning, she hesitated at the edge of her closet, staring at the same lineup of muted sweaters and ill-fitting jeans that had been her uniform for years. Her hand hovered over the grey cardigan she wore most often, but Coffin's voice echoed in her mind. "You've been hiding too long, Jennifer." That was how she ended up in front of Coffin's apartment a half-hour later, her heart pounding. She hadn't even called ahead, unsure if she'd actually have the courage to follow through. Coffin opened the door, his dark eyes widening slightly in surprise before a grin spread across his face. "Jennifer," he said, stepping aside to let her in, "this is unexpected. I need your help," she said quickly, her hands clutched tightly around the strap of her purse, his brow furrowed in concern, but before he could ask, she blurted out, I want to change. I mean, really change. I don't know where to start, but I can't keep being like this." Kyson nodded slowly, a softness in his gaze that made her feel safe. "All right," he said simply. "Let's start small." The thrift store was cramped and chaotic, but Kyson navigated it with ease, pulling items from racks and holding them up for her approval. Jennifer felt out of place at first, clutching a plain blouse she grabbed out of habit, while Kyson browsed with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times. "This," he said finally, holding up a deep blue dress with delicate buttons down the front. "Try it on." Jennifer hesitated, her fingers brushing over the fabric. "It's too much," she murmured, shaking her head. "It's not," Kyson insisted gently. "Trust me." In the dressing room, Jennifer almost didn't recognize herself. The dress hugged her figure in ways that felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable, and the color brought out a warmth in her complexion she'd never noticed before. When she stepped out, Kyson's approving smile was all the reassurance she needed. "See? I told you." The changes didn't happen all at once. Jennifer was still Jennifer, reserved, cautious, unsure of how to fully embrace the person Kyson seemed to see in her. But every small step felt like progress. She let Kyson take her to a salon where the stylist trimmed away years of neglect and gave her a soft, layered cut that framed her face. The difference was subtle but striking, and when she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, she felt an unfamiliar rush of pride. Kyson noticed too. "There she is," he said with a grin. "The woman who's been hiding all this time." Jennifer laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even her. "I'm starting to think you've got too much faith in me." "No such thing," he replied, his tone serious now. "You're worth every bit of it." It wasn't just her appearance that began to shift. Her interactions with others did too. Jennifer found herself smiling more, making eye contact instead of staring at the ground. At work, a co-worker complimented her new haircut, and instead of brushing it off, she managed a shy, "Thank you." Even strangers seemed to notice. On the bus one evening, an older woman offered Jennifer a warm smile, and for once, Jennifer didn't immediately wonder if it was pity. One night, Kyson invited her to a small gathering at his friend's house. Jennifer almost said no, her nerves threatening to get the better of her, but his gentle encouragement convinced her to give it a chance. The evening was simple, just a few people sharing food and conversation, but for Jennifer, it was monumental. She found herself laughing at stories, asking questions, and even sharing a few of her own. "You're different," Kyson said quietly as they walked back to his car that night. Jennifer frowned slightly. "Different how?" "Lighter," he said, his voice soft. "Like you're finally letting yourself breathe." Jennifer didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled. The bond between them deepened in ways Jennifer hadn't expected. Kyson wasn't just a friend or a mentor. He was someone who saw her for who she was and didn't flinch. One evening, as they sat on a park bench overlooking the city lights, Kyson turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Jennifer," he began, his voice low and steady, "I care about you, more than I think I realized at first." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I'm not saying this to put pressure on you," he continued. "I just want you to know where I stand. Because what I see in you, it's beautiful, and it's worth everything." Jennifer's heart ached at the honesty in his words. She wasn't sure she deserved that kind of devotion, but in that moment, she wanted to believe she did. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyson reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." Jennifer had never known happiness like this. It was quiet, unassuming, and nothing like the sweeping gestures of romance she'd read about in books. With Kyson, happiness felt like the warmth of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. A calm she had thought was out of reach. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following months. Their days were filled with laughter, their evenings with whispered dreams of what could be. Kyson spoke of opening a small repair shop, something steady and reliable. Jennifer shyly mentioned the idea of going back to school, maybe studying counseling to help people like her, people who had forgotten how to hope. "I think you'd be amazing at that," Kyson said one evening as they sat by the lake outside the city, their picnic blanket spread on the grass. "You've got a way of seeing people, Jennifer. Not just who they are, but who they could be." She blushed at the compliment, still unaccustomed to his unwavering belief in her. "I don't know," she said softly. "Sometimes I think I'm still figuring out who I could be." "That's the best part," Kyson replied, his voice steady. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just keep moving forward." The day of the accident started like any other. Kyson had surprised Jennifer with a plan to drive out to a field of sunflowers he'd read about online. "They'll be in full bloom this time of year," he'd said, his excitement infectious. As they drove, the miles of open road stretched before them, dotted with rolling hills and pockets of farmland. Jennifer leaned back in her seat, letting the breeze from the open window tangle her hair. She felt light, unburdened, as though the weight she'd carried for so long had finally lifted. "I could get used to this," she murmured, watching Kyson's profile as he drove, his hands relaxed on the wheel. "Good," he said with a grin, "because I'm planning on making this a regular thing." The sun was low in the sky when they started the drive back. Jennifer was still clutching the bouquet of sunflowers Kyson had picked for her, the petals bright and golden against her lap. It happened so fast that she barely had time to process it. One moment they were talking, laughing about something she couldn't even remember now. The next, Kyson's sharp intake of breath filled the car as a deer bolted out of the woods, its body illuminated by the headlights. "Kyson!" Jennifer gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. He yanked the wheel hard to the right, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The world tilted violently, and Jennifer felt herself thrown sideways as the car careened off the road. There was a sickening crunch of metal, the shattering of glass, and then nothing. Jennifer woke to the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the sharp sting of antiseptic. Her body ached in ways she didn't know were possible, and when she tried to move, pain flared through her chest. A nurse appeared at her side almost immediately, her voice calm but firm. "Take it easy, sweetheart. You've been through a lot." Jennifer's thoughts were sluggish, fragmented, but one name rose above the fog in her mind. "Kyson?" she croaked, her throat dry and raw. "Where's Kyson?" The nurse's face fell, her silence saying everything Jennifer didn't want to hear. "No," Jennifer whispered, her voice breaking. "No, he can't be." "I'm so sorry," the nurse said gently, her hand resting on Jennifer's arm. "He didn't make it." The days that followed were a blur of grief and pain. Jennifer learned she had survived the crash with multiple injuries, the most serious being damage to her heart. The doctors had implanted a defibrillator to keep her alive, but she felt anything but. The physical pain was one thing. The emotional agony was another. Kyson was gone. The man who had taught her how to believe in herself, who had shown her what love could look like, had been ripped away in an instant. She replayed the accident over and over in her mind, haunted by the thought that she might have done something differently, said something, seen the deer sooner. But no matter how many times she tortured herself with the what-ifs, the outcome remained the same. Jennifer's days back at her grandmother's home were slow, heavy with the weight of recovery. The small familiar house that once held warm memories now felt suffocating, its walls pressing in on her grief and guilt. Every creak of the floorboards and smell of fresh brewed tea reminded her of Kyson in ways she couldn't escape. Grandma Renee did her best to care for her, even when Jennifer resisted. She cooked simple meals, made sure Jennifer took her medication, and sat beside her during the long, quiet afternoons. Jennifer appreciated the effort, but struggled to meet her grandmother's worried gaze. "You've been given a chance, Chow," Renee said one morning, her hands wrapping firmly around Jennifer's as they sat at the kitchen table. "Don't waste it hiding." Jennifer nodded mechanically, though her heart wasn't in it. She wanted to move forward, to honor Kyson's memory, by living the way he'd encouraged her to. But the weight of his absence felt like chains around her ankles. It was Renee who suggested the walk in the woods. "The fresh air will do you good," she said, helping Jennifer into a jacket. "You need to get out of this house." Jennifer reluctantly agreed, more to appease her grandmother than out of any real desire to leave. The trees loomed tall and familiar, their branches swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. Renee hummed softly as they walked, the sound mingling with the rustle of leaves underfoot. For a moment, Jennifer felt a faint sense of peace. The world beyond the trees seemed distant, and with it, the pain she carried. But as she stepped forward, a sharp jolt ran through her chest. She gasped, clutching at her heart as her legs buckled beneath her. "Jennifer!" Renee's voice was panicked, her hands trembling as she knelt beside her granddaughter. "Stay with me, Chow! Stay with me!" But Jennifer couldn't respond. The pain intensified, and then everything went dark. The voices were faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. Renee's cries, frantic and desperate, rose above them, begging someone, anyone, to help. The blur of flashing lights and distant sirens seeped into Jennifer's consciousness before slipping away again. By the time the paramedics arrived, Jennifer was still, her face pale and lifeless. "I'm sorry, ma'am," one of them said softly, his expression grim. "She's gone." "No," Renee said, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. "She's not gone. She can't be." The rain fell in steady sheets on the day of Jennifer's funeral, soaking the ground and mingling with the tears of the small crowd gathered around her grave. Friends, neighbors, and even a few of Jennifer's old co-workers stood solemnly, their heads bowed as the pastor spoke. Renee stood at the front, gripping her umbrella tightly as she stared at the simple wooden coffin that held the only family she had left. "It's not fair," she whispered, her voice breaking as she addressed no one in particular. "She's been through so much already. Why did God have to take her now?" The pastor offered kind words about Jennifer's resilience and the lives she had touched, but they barely registered in Renee's mind. All she could think about was the empty house she would return to, the silence that would replace Jennifer's presence. A sudden crack of thunder interrupted the service, followed by a blinding flash of lightning that struck the coffin with a deafening roar. The crowd gasped, stepping back in shock as the air filled with the acrid smell of burning wood. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from inside the coffin, a faint sound, a gasp, ragged and strained, but undeniably alive. Jennifer's chest heaved, her lungs drawing in air as her eyes fluttered open. The crowd erupted into chaos, some screaming, others frozen in disbelief. Renee dropped her umbrella, falling to her knees beside the coffin. "Jennifer!" she cried, her hands trembling as she reached for her granddaughter. "Oh, my sweet girl!" The hospital was a whirlwind of activity as Jennifer was rushed into the emergency room. Doctors and nurses hovered over her, running tests and checking vitals, while Renee sat anxiously in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. Hours later, a doctor emerged, his expression a mix of astonishment and relief. "She's stable," he said, and Renee let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Was she—" Renee hesitated, searching for the right words. "Was she really gone?" The doctor nodded slowly. "She was in a state of profound cardiac arrest. It's extraordinary, almost impossible, that she came back. But the defibrillator implanted in her heart was likely triggered by the lightning strike. It restarted her heart just in time." Renee pressed a hand to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "A miracle," she whispered. When Jennifer finally woke, the hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Renee sat at her bedside, her hand resting gently over Jennifer's. "What happened?" Jennifer croaked, her voice hoarse. "You came back to me," Renee said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "God gave you back to me." Jennifer didn't fully understand, but the look in her grandmother's eyes told her everything she needed to know. She had been given a second chance, a chance few ever received. Jennifer woke the next morning with a strange heaviness in her chest. Not the kind of heaviness grief left behind. This was different, subtle. It sat deep, quiet, as if her body were trying to tell her something before her mind could catch up. She dismissed it as exhaustion from the ordeal of the last few days. But as the hours turned into days, the feeling persisted. A faint nausea crept in during the mornings, and her energy wavered in a way she couldn't quite explain. She mentioned it to Renee one afternoon, more as an afterthought than a concern. "I think you should see a doctor," Renee said firmly, folding her hands on the table. Jennifer hesitated. She'd already spent enough time in hospital beds, and the thought of returning made her stomach twist. But the look in her grandmother's eyes was unyielding. The clinic was quiet, the walls painted in calming shades of blue and green. Jennifer sat in the waiting room, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She told herself it was probably nothing, a side effect of the defibrillator maybe, or just the stress of recent events. When the doctor finally called her back, Jennifer braced herself for another round of tests and clinical jargon. But what she heard instead left her breathless. "Jennifer," the doctor said gently, a cautious smile on her face, "you're pregnant." The words hung in the air, almost incomprehensible. Jennifer blinked, her thoughts scrambling to catch up. That's not possible," she stammered. "It is," the doctor replied. "I know it might come as a shock, but based on your test results, you're about 8 weeks along." 8 weeks. Jennifer's heart ached as realization set in. Kyson, this baby, his baby, was growing inside her. Back at home, Jennifer sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Renee moved quietly around the room, giving her space to process. "I don't even know where to begin," Jennifer admitted finally, her voice trembling. Renee placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Begin by knowing this is a gift, Chow. A piece of Kyson still with you." Jennifer nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. It felt like too much and not enough all at once. a reminder of what she'd lost, but also what she'd gained. In the weeks that followed, Jennifer's world shifted. The grief that had consumed her didn't disappear, but it softened, making room for something else. She found herself thinking about Kyson more often, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with a tender longing. She remembered his laugh, the way he always knew just what to say, and how he'd believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. At night, as she lay in bed, she would rest her hand on her stomach and whisper to the tiny life growing inside her. "Your daddy was a good man," she'd say softly. "The best man I've ever known." The baby became her anchor, pulling her forward when she felt like drifting back into despair. Every flutter, every small change in her body was a reminder that Kyson's love hadn't ended. It had taken root, growing in ways she never could have imagined. Renee was a steady presence throughout Jennifer's pregnancy, her quiet strength carrying them both through the harder days. She cooked nourishing meals, made sure Jennifer rested, and accompanied her to every doctor's appointment. One evening, as they sat together folding tiny baby clothes, Renee looked at Jennifer and said, "You're going to be a wonderful mother." Jennifer smiled faintly, smoothing out a little onesie. "I hope so," she said. "I want this baby to know, to feel all the love Kyson would have given them." "They will," Renee assured her, "because you carry that love in you. It's part of who you are now." As the months passed, Jennifer found small ways to keep Kyson's memory alive. She framed a photo of the two of them from one of their many walks and placed it on the nightstand beside her bed. She talked to the baby about him, sharing stories of his kindness, his humor, and the way he'd changed her life. Sometimes, when she spoke of him, she could almost feel his presence, a warmth that wrapped around her like a quiet reassurance. Jennifer counted down the final weeks of her pregnancy with a mixture of anticipation and quiet anxiety. Each passing day brought her closer to meeting the tiny life that had become her beacon of hope, but it also brought a gnawing fear. Would she be enough? Could she give this child everything they deserved? Renee reassured her often, her words as steady as the ground beneath Jennifer's feet. "You're stronger than you think, Chow. You've already given this baby the most important thing, a mother who loves them deeply." Jennifer wanted to believe her, and sometimes, when she felt the baby's soft kicks or caught herself humming a lullaby, she didn't even remember knowing. She almost did. The baby arrived on an early spring morning as the first blush of sunlight filtered through the curtains. Jennifer had been surrounded by the gentle encouragement of nurses and the firm support of Renee, who held her hand through every contraction. And then, after hours that felt both endless and fleeting, there was a cry, a sound so raw and perfect, it brought tears to Jennifer's eyes. When they placed the baby in her arms, Jennifer felt an overwhelming rush of emotion. His tiny face, still scrunched and red from the effort of coming into the world, bore a resemblance so uncanny that Jennifer's breath caught. Kyson. She traced the outline of the baby's nose, the curve of his lips, marveling at how much he looked like his father. "Hi, little one," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've got his smile, you know that?" Renee, standing nearby, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "It's a miracle, Jennifer. He's here because of love. Don't ever forget that." In the weeks that followed, Jennifer was introduced to the delicate chaos of motherhood. Nights blurred into days as she adjusted to the rhythm of feedings, diaper changes, and the quiet, tender moments in between. It wasn't easy. There were times when exhaustion clung to her like a heavy fog, and she found herself sitting in the rocking chair, holding her son and whispering prayers for strength. But even in those moments, there was an undeniable joy, a quiet, persistent sense of purpose that anchored her. She named him Gabriel, a nod to the angel who had delivered messages of hope in the stories her grandmother used to tell. "You are my message," she murmured to him one night as he slept soundly in her arms. A reminder that love doesn't end. It carries on, even when we think it's gone. As Gabriel grew, so did Jennifer's sense of self. The woman who once felt small and unsure now stood taller, her confidence rooted in the responsibility of raising a child. She began to see herself through new eyes, not as someone broken by loss, but as someone shaped by it, made stronger. The village, once a place of isolation and painful memories, transformed into a community that embraced her. Neighbors who had watched her struggle now watched her thrive, offering kind words and helping hands when she needed them. Jennifer started spending more time at the community center, volunteering to organize events and run support groups for others facing hardships. "You've got a gift," one of the center's directors told her after a particularly heartfelt session. "People listen to you because you've lived it. You're proof that things can get better." Jennifer smiled softly. She didn't feel like a beacon of hope, but if her story could help even one person, it was worth sharing. On Gabriel's first birthday, the house was filled with laughter and the scent of freshly baked cake. Renee had gone all out, decorating the small living room with colorful streamers and balloons. Jennifer watched her son toddle around, his tiny hands clutching a toy truck, and felt a swell of gratitude so profound it nearly overwhelmed her. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and Gabriel was fast asleep, Jennifer sat by the window with a cup of tea. The night was quiet, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny blessings. She reached for the framed photo on the table beside her, the one of her and Kyson on one of their many walks. "I wish you could see him," she said softly, her fingers brushing the glass. "He's everything we dreamed of, Kyson, and I'm doing my best to make sure he knows you, to make sure he feels all the love you would have given him." Over time, Jennifer's story spread beyond the village. People came to her not just for advice, but for inspiration, drawn to the way she had turned her pain into purpose. Her work at the community center expanded, and she began organizing workshops on resilience and hope, sharing her journey with anyone who needed to hear it. One afternoon, as she packed up after a session, a woman approached her, tears in her eyes. "You don't know how much I needed this," the woman said. "Hearing you talk about second chances, it makes me believe I can have one too." Jennifer squeezed her hand, a warmth spreading through her chest. "You can," she said firmly. "We all can." Years later, as Gabriel ran through the fields behind their house, his laughter echoing in the open air, Jennifer stood by the fence, watching him with a smile. Life hadn't unfolded the way she'd imagined, but it had given her something far greater than she ever thought possible. Kyson's love had carried her through the darkest of times, and Gabriel's presence reminded her every day that miracles could grow from the most unexpected places. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Jennifer felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her way through the shadows, and in their place, there was light. A light she knew would never fade. The journey of Jennifer in this story is a deeply moving and inspiring testament to human resilience and the enduring power of love. Her life, marked by heartbreak, loss, and moments of despair, unfolds into a tale of profound transformation and hope. From a vulnerable young woman struggling to find her place, Jennifer evolves into a courageous, self-assured mother, carrying the memory of Kyson and their love forward with grace and strength. What makes her journey so compelling is its authenticity. Jennifer's struggles are raw and relatable, from the sting of betrayal to the crushing weight of grief. Yet, she doesn't let her pain define her. Instead, she learns to embrace life's second chances. Caisson's influence and the miracle of Gabriel's birth serve as reminders that love doesn't end with loss. It continues to grow and inspire. The story imparts a powerful lesson. Life's challenges can shape us, but they don't have to break us. Jennifer's ability to transform her sorrow into purpose and her pain into a source of strength highlights the resilience of the human spirit. Her journey reminds us to cherish love, hold on to hope, and find meaning even in the face of life's darkest moments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.